Gather round, children, and I'll tell you a tale. Welcome to the Dark Omnibus. For as long as I can remember, I've been freaked out by ghosts and demons. In the past, I've always told myself they didn't exist, but throughout my childhood, my grandmother was very insistent that they were real. She was an alcoholic, my grandmother, and a devout Catholic. Many times throughout the years, I heard her talking about how she saw things like demons and darkness around us. On quite a few occasions, when I would spend the night at her house, she would come into my room late at night while I was asleep and use an oil-laden finger to draw crosses on my head. Her version of protection, I suppose, but I still found it weird and creepy even at such a young age. And then, one day, she was gone. My grandmother died peacefully in her sleep, and my mom was left with the duty of packing and cleaning her mother's house. Me, being 6 or 7 years old at the time, was eager to tag along and help her. Not so much because I liked the work, but because I liked time with my mother. On one of the first few days after the funeral when we were at the house, my mom had mentioned that some other people might be stopping by to lend a hand with the monotonous list of chores that lay before her. We got to work, though admittedly I lost interest in boxes and cleanser a few minutes into the job, as most children do, and thought I would go explore the house. The other families that my mother spoke of had shown up a few minutes before, so everyone was busy scuttling around the house and lending a helping hand. I wandered around the downstairs, noticing that no one was paying much mind to me. And after searching every room, I went to the stairs and made my way to the second floor. My grandmother's house was not large by any means, but it also wasn't small. It was a typical mid-century colonial, nondescript and settled between two other houses just like it, on a quiet street lined with a similar array of brick and tapestry. It had a basement, which I'd never been in and frankly was never much interested in for obvious reasons. I felt the same about the attic, so my exploration pursuits were limited to the first and second floor. Arriving at the top step, I could still hear the bustle of bodies on the floor below, and the echoes of somber condolences as more help arrived through the front door. I rounded the corner and entered the hallway, where I was presented with 4 doors to choose from. I knew the door I wanted, however, and ignored the first 3 as I made my way to the end of the hall and entered my grandmother's room. I was immediately greeted with the smell of stale mothballs mixed with a pungent floral bouquet, the perfume my grandmother wore. Then I noticed a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, sitting on the floor at the end of the bed. She sat cross-legged, picking at her nails. I remember thinking how pretty the pink flowers were on her yellow dress. I assumed she was the daughter of one of the families that had come to help my mother, and that she'd gotten bored with the cleaning quicker than I had and come up to escape and explore. I took a step toward her, and the floorboard beneath my foot creaked, which caused her to drop her hands into her lap and look up at me. She smiled. She stood and smoothed the wrinkles in her dress and looked up at me again, still smiling. "What's your name?" she said. I told her. "What's yours?" I asked. "Claire," she replied, and her smile widened. She then asked me if I'd like to play hide and seek. I had never been very good at hide and seek. Being an only child, I hadn't had much practice. But a game sounded fun in the midst of all the gloomy frowns and demeanors that had entered my world since my grandmother's passing. I agreed to the game and she nearly jumped for joy. Claire said she had wanted to be the seeker first, so she covered her eyes with her hands and dropped her head face down into the mattress and began counting. 1, 2, 3. I looked around, panicking. I wished silently that I was better at this and opted for the closet right next to the bed. I opened the door as carefully and quietly as I could and stepped inside. Then closed the door with the same amount of care, hoping Claire hadn't heard me. Once inside, I immediately became aware of the complete and total darkness around me. This was an old house, so the light switch for the light inside the closet was located on the outside of the door, not inside. I weighed my fear of the dark with my need to show Claire how good I was at this game, and decided that I would brave the dark and wait for her to find me. I could no longer hear her counting outside, so I assumed she must be wandering around looking for me. I drew my legs in and wrapped my arms around my knees. I guess as children we think that making ourselves smaller makes us more quiet. Funny now, but perfectly logical at the time. Minutes passed, and she still hadn't found me. By now, the darkness was starting to weigh down on me, and despite my best efforts, I was beginning to feel that lump of anxiety lodging itself in the back of my throat. I truly wanted to hold it together. I needed to. But after 10 minutes, I couldn't take it any longer. I had to get out. In a complete reversal of roles, I decided I would go and look for Claire, so I stood and felt my way to the door. It was only a step or two away, and after finding it, I slid my hand down the door jamb until I found the handle and turned it, far too excited to step out into the acrid scent of mothballs and stale flowers. But the door didn't open. It was locked. In the half second it took my brain to process the situation, I panicked. I began kicking and pounding at the door and jerking at the door handle violently. My voice erupted in wails of uncontrollable sobs drenched in horror as I screamed for my mother to come let me out. Then, my lungs began sucking air through gritted teeth, and even in the darkness my vision blurred. My legs grew weak beneath me and started to buckle. And then, the doorknob turned and the door slowly crept open. I fell to my knees in sudden relief and basked in the pale light of the room. I stayed there, slumped against the doorframe until the feeling returned to my legs, and then I stood and walked back into the bedroom, expecting to find the girl in the yellow dress. But there was no Claire, and the door leading to the hallway was now closed as well. Another surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins at the thought of that door being locked as well, but solace washed over me as I turned the doorknob, and the door swung inward without complaint. I took off through the doorway and sprinted down the hall. I rounded the corner and flew down the stairs, skipping every other step, and then proceeded through the front door and out into the yard. I found my mother there, talking to a neighbor. She was obviously upset about something, but when she saw me and the look on my face, she opened her arms and welcomed me. I told her about the closet and how it had locked. Then I told her about Claire and the game of hide and seek. She said she didn't know of anyone named Claire, or of any other children in the house. She said the group of people who were supposed to come and help had never showed that day, so the job of packing and cleaning the house was left for she and I alone. To this day, I have no idea who the families were that I saw in the house that day, or who the girl was in the yellow dress. The pink flowers were beautiful though. I have lived in the same room in the same house my entire life. I am now a 19-year-old Catholic biology major who firmly believes in some form of afterlife and that spirits do actually exist. My evidence starts from infancy. My mother and father have both told me stories of times when I was in my crib crying, like most babies do. But when they would arrive to check on me, I would be completely calm and smiling. By the age of 2, when I was able to start forming complete sentences and thought, I'm told I once said to my mother, "Don't worry, the man in the rocking chair keeps me safe." You see, my grandfather's rocking chair was in my bedroom at the time. He had apparently sat in that chair every single day until he eventually died of a heart attack. There were other experiences my family shared, namely my father, who had always complained that he felt like he was being followed around while he cut the grass. Many times, I would notice him quickly turning his head or being startled while doing yard work. Another notable story comes from when I was 7 years old. I had a plastic Godzilla toy. You know, one of the ones with the button on its chest, and when pressed would cause the torso to rotate and the head to turn and roar. One night when I was having trouble sleeping, which seemed to happen often, that Godzilla toy suddenly sprung to life, turning back and forth, roaring all the while. I was scared stiff the rest of the night. On other occasions, my father would swear he had seen a woman in a red dress walking down the hallway toward a bedroom, but there was no one ever there. These are many examples and a long list of evidence that my house was truly haunted, but the one that's permanently burned into my mind is the time I met one of these spirits face to face. To fully understand this story, I need to explain the layout of the upstairs portion of the house. The second floor is very small, consisting of only a bathroom in the middle of the hallway, and mine and my sister's rooms positioned at each end of the hall with the stairs set about halfway in between. At this point, I'm around 18 years old and had been working late one night. I arrived home around 2 a.m. and my need for sleep won the fight against my need for food, so I decided I'd head to bed and have a big breakfast in the morning. I dropped my bag and my keys by the small table at the foot of the stairs, and grabbed the banister with an exhausted arm and started the long climb to the top of the stairs in the dark. I noticed movement and looked up to see a dark figure had started down towards me, and that we were going to cross paths about halfway up the staircase. The figure was the same height and build as my sister, and I truly believed that it was her coming down the stairs. And when the figure was about 3 steps away, I muttered something like goodnight to her, and actually stepped out of the way so she could pass. But when the figure reached me, it immediately dissipated into the air. It said nothing to me. It was there, and then it simply was not. Sometimes I question whether it was just my tired eyes seeing things in the dark, and if this was nothing more than exhaustion taking hold of my mind. But I truly believed, and still do to this day, that I crossed paths with someone or something that night. A few years ago, my wife and I were staying at her parents' house alone. Her parents had gone south on vacation and asked if my wife and I could look after the place for a few weeks while they were gone. Since she and I were used to being cramped in a tiny loft apartment, a fortnight in a rural country home sounded like our own little vacation, so we were quick to accept. The first few days and nights were calm and peaceful. We spent the mornings eating breakfast in the sunroom, and in the evenings we enjoyed hot coffee while lounging in the swing on their wraparound porch, taking in the clean country air. By the end of the first week, we had forgotten all about the hustle and bustle of cramped city life, and had almost begun to imagine that this was how it was going to be forever. Late Saturday night of the first weekend, we'd gone to bed around 10 p.m., and I had woken up a few hours later needing to use the bathroom. You know that feeling when you wake in the middle of the night, where you're sure if you open your eyes you'll be fully awake and not be able to go back to sleep? When you do whatever you need to do with eyes half shut. That's how I made my way down the darkened hallway towards the stairs. The bathroom was on the first floor, so I made my way down the stairs, white-knuckling the railing to support my tired frame. As I cleared the last step, I chanced to glance and looked up into the living room. It was there I noticed something odd. The couch cushions laid in complete disarray, some strewn across the couch and others piled in the nearest corner like they'd been thrown there. This immediately struck me as odd because my wife notoriously straightened up the entire house before bed each night, as if she was afraid her parents would arrive home early unannounced and she didn't want them to see the place a mess. I shrugged it off, deciding I'd ask her about it in the morning, and continued through the dining room toward the bathroom. Once there, I felt my way to the toilet and sat down to do my business. I'd been sitting a few minutes. The only noise accompanying the obvious was the sound of my breathing, which seemed far louder than normal in the stark silence of night. 3 loud, swift bangs rung out across the door, ripping me from the comfort of my half-sleep euphoria. Suddenly alert, I processed the knocking and called out, "I need just a minute," to my wife, who obviously needed to get into the bathroom. There was no response. All I heard from the other side of the door was raspy breathing, loud and rhythmic, almost like snoring, but not quite. I hurriedly finished my business and cleaned myself up. Sheepishly, I opened the door, expecting my wife to either be standing there impatient or asleep against the wall waiting her turn. But when I looked out into the room, I saw nothing. I assumed my wife had gone back to bed, so I made my way back upstairs to our room, far more awake than when I had made the journey down. I arrived at the side of the bed and my wife lay there with her eyes partially open. "I told you I'd be right out," I said to her. "What's with all the noise?" she said, ignoring what I'd just said. "You didn't knock?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes were fully open now and she sat up on one elbow, clearly trying to make sense of what was going on. I was doing the same. I told her about the couch cushions, and about the knocking and the breathing. She assured me that she had most definitely straightened up the living room before she'd come upstairs, and that she'd never gotten out of bed, that she'd been woken up by the pounding noise downstairs and thought I had fallen or knocked something over. Understandably, we were both pretty creeped out at this point. We didn't sleep much that night, but we heard no other noises and finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning. The next day, she and I sat in the living room. She read a book while I read the paper, both of us tired and still a little uneasy after the previous night's episode. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang. The sound was massive, almost like a gunshot, and immediately after, all the lights in the house flickered off. The power was out. I found the circuit panel and flicked the power breakers back on and went to investigate. In the dining room, we found a large mirror on the floor that had previously been hanging on the wall behind it, and behind that mirror was a broken power outlet. The mirror must have come off the wall and hit the plugs in the outlet, which completely wrecked the entire assembly. This didn't seem like much of a big deal until we checked the back of the mirror and saw that the wire that attaches the mirror to the wall was fully intact, as was the fixture on the wall that it attached to. This was a heavy mirror. There was no way it could have lifted itself off the wall only to drop vertically to hit the plugs below. We had no explanation for this. Over the next few days, we had many other occurrences. We would walk into the dining room and find all the dining furniture rearranged, or we would hear the chairs pulling away from the table, while neither my wife or I were in the room. We could hear the distinct sound of creaking chairs like someone had sat down, and we would even occasionally hear people in other rooms talking in muted voices, but the voices would immediately stop when we entered the room. When my wife's parents finally arrived home, we told them about the things we'd experienced. They had the strangest looks on their faces, not empathetic looks, mind you. They looked at us like we'd lost our minds. Once in a while, we still house sit for them while they are out of town, and the same things we experienced before still happen. Odd noises, hushed voices, and even heavy furniture, which would normally take multiple people to lift, will be moved around and rearranged. After that first visit, though, we decided that our cramped life in the city wasn't so bad after all.